Welcome to this presentation on organisational culture. So today we're going to cover 3 questions relating to organisational culture. What is it? Why does it matter? And how do you manage it? So what is organisational culture? Well, in very simple terms, it's known as the way things are done around here. And this really refers to not only the types of tasks that organisations undertake, but how they approach, how they solve those tasks. And Edgar Schein, who's a professor at MIT Sloan School of Management, and a renowned scholar on organisational culture, defines it as follows. So a pattern of basic assumptions invented, discovered, or developed by a given group as it learns to cope with its problems of external adaptation and internal integration that have worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. So it's essentially a set of unspoken assumptions derived from past problem solving and effective solutions to past problems. And this is just a way of kind of mapping that idea. So we have a set of common experiences, maybe at an early stage of an organization, and they've had to face particular problems. And as they try to address those problems, they begin to develop an effective way of solving them. And over time, they begin to develop a shared worldview because of interactions between them, and a group begins to understand the appropriate way of solving that set of problems. And then eventually you'll begin to develop a valid set of assumptions. So how to solve problems and make decisions that becomes quite implicit or tacit in people's behavior. So when problems are approached, they're not even really, the way of solving them isn't really thought about anymore. It becomes quite implicit in how people behave. And also, culture will also affect what is valued or is important in decision making as well. So, what's the best way of dealing with a customer complaint, or determining when a product is good enough to ship from a quality perspective. Okay, so this is a continuation of Schein's work on organizational culture, and he suggests it's a bit like an iceberg. So there's what we see on the surface, but underneath that there are kind of underpinning values and assumptions. So in terms of what we can see within organizations, both in terms of people's behavior, but the material setting of an organization, these are the artifacts of an organization's culture. So artifacts are the visible elements of culture, so what you can see around you, and they're repositories of meaning, both in terms of people's behavior, but also the context, so the material setting, so how the organization is furnished, what the office design is like, and so forth. So artifacts are anything tangible, overt, or verbally identifiable elements in any organization. So examples are hours of work, perhaps office jokes, whether people arrive early or late to meetings, whether people will go for extended lunches, whether they'll socialize outside work, and also incentives. So whether these are extrinsic incentives such as payment systems, or there's a reliance on intrinsic incentives and trying to create shared purpose and motivation. And also there are kind of company stories and narratives that an organization might circulate within a company that you begin to hear about, which will also add to the culture. There's just a couple of examples on the left-hand side. So I'm a qualitative researcher, and my PhD was an ethnography of organizational learning, where I spent 9 months working within a UK company in its marketing department, and I wanted to understand how organizational learning was undertaken, and part of that was to conduct interviews, but also observe meetings and general office behavior. So I had a seat in the office, and I tried to understand what was going on around me, So we've got a couple of examples here. So the first is Facebook and the Open Plan office with Mark Zuckerberg there. And if you're perhaps observing such a setting in terms of artifacts, you might read from the office that because it's open plan and we've got people at different levels of the organization all working together, maybe it's a non-hierarchical environment. That's maybe one assumption you could make from looking at the artifacts. By comparison, the photograph below is from a health service planning meeting in the UK, and it's quite a different environment here. And we could pick out lots of things from this. But one aspect that I suppose stands out for me is there's a concern with papers. So you look at all the people around this meeting room, they've got a lot of papers in front of them. In the foreground there, I think we can also see a traffic light system with green and amber coding, perhaps of different performance indicators. So perhaps we might read here that this particular set of actors talking about the health services in their area is quite process driven. And actually that's quite common in healthcare because of quality and safety concerns. It's important that processes are followed. But two quite different environments there, which of course will also look different now in the context of COVID-19. Okay, so below the level of artifacts in terms of what we see, we then have values and implicit norms. So that's what we think. And these are the behaviors and attitudes that are particularly valued in the organization, which might be actual values or might be aspirational. And I think when we talk about aspirational values, you can think about a company's mission statement, for example, which might embody a set of values that people aspire, or the leaders of a company aspire that they work to, but whether they're followed in practice is a different matter. And I think just going back to artifacts there around what you can observe around you, they can be quite tough to interpret. So I made a couple of assumptions there from looking at a couple of pictures of what kind of culture Facebook or a health service planning meeting has. And I think if you want to make sense of culture, as well as observing meetings, observing the kind of office culture, banter around the office, it's very important then to follow up perhaps with interviews and actually ask people directly about the culture and try to qualify your own assumptions. And indeed, when I did my ethnography, a lot of it was observational work, but I also interviewed members of staff at various levels of the organization in order to qualify my own assumptions. So going back to values and shared norms, this is very much about how people in the organization represent it to themselves and to others. And as I just said, they can be real or aspirational. So we've got a set of values here that belong to a company that was on their website. So respect, integrity, communication, and excellence. So quite virtuous or earnest values. I wonder if you can guess which company they belong to. And it was actually Enron, which closed back in 2001. And if you can recall, the reason that they closed was because there was systematic accounting fraud within the company, and their closure resulted in an 11 billion loss for their shareholders. So as I said, you might espouse to have a certain set of values, but they may not be kind of manifested in practice. Okay, so we've got artifacts on the surface, then values and implicit norms, and then underlying both are assumptions. So not just what we think, but why we think it. And these can become quite taken for granted as people just get used to acting in a particular way, quite habitually even, without thinking anymore about why do we think something. So the artifacts are kind of the product or outcome of a set of assumptions that actually drive the behavior. So assumptions are very deep-seated beliefs or premises, usually implicit or taken for granted, that we seldom articulate or even recognize. So they can be very difficult actually to articulate. And these affect the criteria that we use in decision-making, often in an organization. So things like, how do we feel about this customer's complaint? How should we deal with it? how do we prioritize our customers, what is valued and important. So, for example, do we reward individual or group behavior, and what is the right way of doing things? So, very broad assumptions. So, to give an example of an assumption at 3M, put fences around people, and all you get are sheep. And this kind of way of working in 3M has been heavily influenced by William McKnight, a past chairman, who talked about the idea of hiring good people and then leave them alone, and very much emphasizing the side of delegating responsibility and encouraging people to use their own initiative. So even now within 3M, they have the 15% rule, where the employees allowed to work on their own kind of pet projects. And I'm sure, as you know, through this this protected time for employees to work on what they want, that's where the post-it comes from in this the narrative of 3M. Okay, so secondly, we've talked a bit about what organizational culture is, particularly through Ed Schein's work, but why does culture matter? And I think one of the key reasons it matters, and I think maybe even more so in the context of COVID-19, is it allows an organization to develop a uniform set of behaviors without having to write them all down, which allows for a degree of stability and consistency across the organization in terms of how people behave. And I think this is particularly important in the context of COVID-19, because it means that people, through the organizational culture, are influenced at a distance. So in big companies, people can behave in similar ways because of the culture without needing micromanagement or conforming with a set of company standards or the handbook in order to know how to behave. It implicitly drives their behaviors. And because of this, companies with strong cultures that are deeply internalized and widely held within the company can make decisions more quickly. There's less need for micromanagement. You can quickly socialize people into the culture because it's quite visible. You can feel it around you. And they tend to have people with higher morale because it tends to generate a sense of belonging if you feel part of a strong culture, which of course isn't necessarily for everyone, but for companies where there is one, you very much feel you're part of the corporate culture. So here's a few, I guess, advantages and disadvantages to having a strong corporate culture. So what one advantage is it's a source of differentiation from other companies. But at the same time, it can make merging with other companies difficult, because if there are two different cultures and they're strong, how do you start to stitch them together? Where are compromises made? It allows employees to identify themselves with the organization, increasing morale, as I said, and at the same time, where there's a strong culture, you tend to attract similar types of employees, which might limit the diversity of thought, and that then can link to groupthink. So if you have a strong group, you can potentially neglect relevant external information because you all tend to think in the same way and trust one another. It facilitates desired behaviors among employees, less micromanagement, quicker decisions, but it can also create extreme behavior among employees because you get used to working in a particular way, so you subscribe to the organization's norms. You may kind of neglect your own norms and standards of behavior because you're trying to comply with the wider norms of the company. It drives cohesion and bonding. People can be socialized quickly, but it does punish those who find it difficult to fit in, and hiring can be biased towards the people that the evaluators think are similar to themselves. And it creates stability and obviously management of people at a distance, but it can also make adapting to environmental change difficult. So you've got a strong organizational building block in terms of culture. If the environment changes, it can be quite difficult to adapt a rigid culture. So why does culture matter? This is just another point here about the relationship between strategy and culture. So this CEO here talks about culture eating strategy for lunch. So you can have a very good strategy, a very solid strategy in place, But if you don't have a culture and enabling systems that support your strategy, then the culture will actually defeat the strategy, because culture is embedded in people's day-to-day behavior. That is what is going to kind of define how the company works over time, rather than the strategy. And I think that the point here is that leaders often like to focus on their strategy, but perhaps don't spend enough time at ground level within the company trying to create the right culture that will support their strategy. So how do you manage culture? How do you manage with culture? So the first thing is to, as a leader of an organization, is to diagnose the culture, to try to understand and map it. So not only looking at the artifacts of the organization, but also the values and underlying assumptions, and think about how Shine's three-stage model to defining culture and understanding culture could be of use here. And then secondly, use multiple touch points to change the culture. So organizational culture is quite pervasive. So you have to look at lots of different aspects of your organization in order to influence it and reinforce the type of culture that's desired. So the hiring, selection, firing processes, socialization and training of new employees, transitions and reward systems. And I guess the main point here is that it constantly needs to be reinforced. So continuous communication, symbolic actions, display of new cultural artifacts that help to highlight to people what kind of culture, what kind of way of behaving is desired, and leadership behavior as well. And I think with COVID-19, some of the research I'm doing on COVID has highlighted in particular the importance of open leadership within healthcare providers. So COVID's had a big impact, as I'm sure you know, on the workforce in the health system. A lot of impacts on staff's mental and physical health and stress and so on. So one way in which some providers have responded to this is through very visible leadership. So the leaders visiting the front line, going down to ward level and trying to support their staff. And then thirdly, so don't stop and go bottom up. So it constantly needs reinforcing. It needs to be particularly reinforced at the level of the front line of a company. And also, as you can't quite see there, also don't neglect subcultures as well. And the point here is that you might have an overarching corporate culture that you're trying to promote, but within the organization, there'll also be subcultures. So for example, in the healthcare system, professional cultures are very important. So the cultures, for example, of doctors, of nurses, of managers will all vary. And with one of my PhD students at UCL in the UK, we did a scoping review of the literature and organizational professional cultures and how the two fit together. So a subculture can reinforce or challenge an organization's overarching aims. Culture is actually used in quite an imprecise way in the literature, and I think there's a need to kind of firm up a bit how culture is defined. I think two anthropologists, Kroeber and Kluckholm, found 164 different definitions of organizational culture. So it's quite a loose term. But in terms of management, it's very important to recognize subcultures. So differences in professions, collective views and values might influence what type of interventions you make within the organization. So you might need to think about how a particular intervention is like to affect doctors, nurses, pharmacists, for example, in a healthcare organization, because they're all likely to respond differently because they've all got these internal subcultures. Okay, so the main takeaway message is culture comes in multiple forms. On the one hand, it's spontaneous and bottom up. So as a group interacts, it will begin to develop patterns and norms of behavior that become part of the culture of that group, often very quickly after a group meets. But it can also be imposed and be top down as well. And this is particularly relevant, of course, in an organization, a big organization, where the leader of a group tries to impose their values, beliefs, and assumptions, or they try to select members to join the organization who already hold similar values and beliefs. And it's very important that the top-down culture aligns effectively with the bottom-up culture. You don't want to see a disjuncture between the two. And culture is also embedded in rules and processes. So staff recruitment and hiring, socialization processes, reward systems, how much senior management gets involved in the operational aspects of a company, what messages they share, and it's the little things reinforced day to day that influence culture. And I think if you want to have an influence on your own organizational culture, it's quite good to start small. So think about your own group perhaps that you manage, and what kind of culture in that group what do you want to promote. And then finally, it intersects with subcultures as well. So it's very important to think about, if you're in a multinational, what impact a national, regional, and professional cultures, perhaps within different functions of the organization, how are they all recognized in the overarching organizational culture and managerial interventions that you might propose within the company. Okay, thank you very much.